Good morning. I found myself a few minutes ago scared to death that I was going to win a copy of my own book. And I guess I've signed a few copies today, but I never know quite what to think about signing books because the Civil War historian Shelby Foote once told me of a writer down south who didn't sell very well, but he was always eager to get his copies out. So he would put all these books in the back of his station wagon, drive all over the South, selling copies and giving them away and just signing one after another. And Shelby said that later the story went about that after he died, that the true collector's edition of his book would be the unsigned ones. So every time I sign a book, I wonder if I'm devaluing it somehow. Well, isn't Andrew Kern marvelous? I wished he had had me speak yesterday so I wouldn't have to follow him. He comes from a certain kind of tradition of preaching, and you're not going to be able to enjoy that with me this morning. I come from the very Catholic, boring world of homiletics, and some good Catholic teaching I've had, but not very good Catholic preaching, I must say. I'm more of a teacher than a speaker, and I'm probably more of a writer than both. So I hope everyone has come nice and caffeinated. I got the Lifetime Achievement Award for CiRCE Institute 10 years ago this summer, and I felt old ever since. So here I am again. I'm not sure that was a perfect blessing or not. I remember telling my mother that I had won it, and she said, "You're not even dead yet." So, and by the way, here's one thing I didn't have to do 10 years ago. Anyway, I want to thank Andrew for honoring me once again. And 10 years ago, I was pretty convinced that I was too young to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award, and I think I still am, but I'm here today to show him that I'm still around and that I may have a couple things left to achieve, though who knows? Time will tell. And as I've been absent from the speaking circuit for some while, on purpose, Andrew's kind invitation provided me with a perfect excuse to set aside what I've been doing and come down here and visit with a lot of good people again. I thank all of you for attending this morning. There's no one in this room, I'm sure, who has anything any less valuable to say than what you'll hear from me. By the way, I hope everyone appreciates the exquisite laziness displayed in the title of my talk, playing off as it does the theme given to this conference. I'm nothing if not economical, but it's not a facile sleight of hand. There's a point to it. Some time ago, a lady came up to me after a talk to say several nice things, but somehow I knew she was building up to a criticism, and so it came. She wanted to complain to me that she believed climbing Parnassus didn't say nearly enough about the religious life, about how education can make us better, more godly people, how classical education can help us to become gentle as sheep but wise as serpents. And what's all this talk, she said, about humanism? In short, she believed the message of the book wasn't spiritual enough. I think it was a fair criticism by one standard, though she was looking for an awful lot from a writer like me, who's always careful not to step out of bounds. I customarily prefer to make the point I'm making and get off stage, and without making other points I didn't intend to make. All I wanted to do in that book was pretty a prescribed set of points to convey. So I only looked at her rather sheepishly and said, I think the book you really wanted would be called Climbing Sinai, which would be a different book and perhaps one much more worth reading than the one I wrote, but a different book it would be. And I've heard this criticism regularly, by the way. Look at some of the customer reviews posted on Amazon. There's that humanist charge again. Read this book, they seem to say. There are a few nice things here, but this author isn't one of us. One of the people said, he's probably a godless secularist. Ouch. That seemed to me an odd thing to say of a mild-mannered Catholic boy who spends a certain portion of every year of his life either in a Benedictine or Trappist monastery, praying with monks and periodically getting his head back in order. That's all fine. But one reviewer charged me with asserting that learning and learning alone, that is in the sense of book learning, school learning, can save the soul. Well, that's much more serious. I did not say that, nor do I believe it. I was trying in that book simply to treat one side of human development, which is the intellectual, and that's all. I didn't believe myself suited in that limited form to treat of more, especially the spiritual. But how silly that may be in the age of Oprah, when nearly everybody feels free to pronounce on anything he knows nothing about. I never said that books alone can save us. I exclude here, of course, Holy Scripture, which isn't so much a book as God's library. Books may be a good start, but so much depends on what we're reading, doesn't it? For instance, from what I can see, I place very little faith in the books most public schools, and probably not a few private ones adopt, not to mention the ones promoted by the New York Times Book Review. And stand by for what will be coming out for school children in a couple of years. So this morning I'd like to take a couple steps toward repairing that misunderstanding and expand just a little bit from my usual sphere of pedagogy and classical education and Greek and Latin, and all that, though including it, and enter into the realm of the spirit a bit. In other words, from a place of half competence for me into a place of near complete incompetence. But you'll indulge me, I think. I'm fascinated by the topic the Institute has set this year just because of those two loaded, haunted, sublime words. The very idea of harmony and the very idea of contemplation, they bid us to leave those comfortable mental landscapes we live in and where we retain some sort of control over our lives and explore something far beyond us. These two ancient words, with Greek and Latin origins, but who's noticing, transcendent, really, and perhaps modern people cannot easily, or at least automatically understand what they mean or what they can mean, without unlearning what they've been told. We are, after all, no longer a people who look up words we can't define. And those two words are not especially among the more operative ones in the culture right now. Though do beware of the day when someone's going to be saying things like, gosh, that's like harmonious, man. And then we'll have another sad instance of verbicide, word killing. Well, it's happened to awesome, so why shouldn't it happen to other fine words? But what those two words mean and what they can mean can arm us with some of the tools to save our culture, if not our culture, certainly ourselves. Because who would possess a soul so disordered as not to wish to live harmoniously with himself and with the world around him? I ask rhetorically, though I know there are many people who do not wish to live this way. As the philosopher Santayana reminded us, it takes patience to appreciate domestic bliss. Volatile spirits prefer unhappiness. By the way, I think it's one of the lessons of monasteries. They show us how harmonious living really is possible. They shame me every time I walk into them, and I walk out always uh, very much resolved to live my life differently, and I do for a few days. And who would not wish to live contemplatively? Not only thoughtfully, which takes less effort, but committed to tapping the depths of existence, to see beyond the veil, to develop a soul that's worthy of taking beyond into the next life, to develop the range of receptivity we find in the Psalms. If all people lived this way, and even if all wished to live this way, most of the problems besieging us on this planet would probably find ready solutions. Well, such is the world that cannot exist right now, of course, all of us being what we are. But there's value in identifying what the building blocks of that world might be, just in case we're inclined to see a world where, as Tennyson said, some work of noble note may yet be done. This ought to be another reason to go to school, to transcend the self and expand our sense of the possible. Though, let us never make the fatal mistake of expecting schools to do all that work. I'd like to talk, though, about what education might have to do with a higher order of experience. John Henry Newman, a hero of mine, and one of the wisest men of all time, once wrote about what he called the harmonious circle of knowledge. Now, what did he, the author of the idea of the university, mean by this? Most likely, he was referring to the sense that there's a complementarity to different forms of knowledge, that when grasped together, those forms somehow interlock. And surely he referred to the idea with which everyone here in this room is familiar, which is the idea that the acquisition of knowledge is about more than filling the mind, however formidable a project that may be in itself, and some of us would be perfectly happy to see the schools do just that. He was talking, of course, though, about the ideal of the artes liberales, the liberal arts. The idea carries the conviction that knowledge actually does have a purpose beyond the practical, even though this idea embraces the practical as well. Because in one sense, all knowledge is practical. It serves some end, if you think about it. The question being whether that end be more immediate or more remote. The purpose of knowledge, or more accurately, the purpose of the pursuit of knowledge, is to form, inform, perhaps and reform the spirit itself, which is a high purpose. No wonder we tend to invest such faith in the possibilities of education. But how does that happen? Well, please don't wait for the United States Department of Education to tell us. And if they try, please delete the message. Anything that a mass of bureaucrats might say must be treated as guilty until proven innocent, or at least foolish until proven innocuous. Maybe this is what Trollope meant when he said that there's no villainy to which education cannot reconcile us. But their guidelines and their bankrupt ideology have helped to get us in the fix we find ourselves. In fact, their depredations might have led many of us to this very room today. Whatever we do, we need to separate ourselves from educational experts and their pseudoscientific language. As with so much else, we must look to the past so that we may walk intelligently into the future. And given all that's happening in the world right now, and the lightning pace with which it's happening, with the mass mind brooding over everything and controlling the thoughts we're allowed to think, I sometimes wonder if intelligent people might constitute the next counterculture. Not smart people who are easy to find, but intelligent people. And not clever people, but intelligent people. And most of all, humbly intelligent people. Let me not so much define or suggest what I might mean, because the effort to define precisely may smother the implications. I'm not talking about people who can simply do many things and invent new gadgets brilliantly, which of course are the kind of people with which the federal government now seems insistent upon filling the world. That is, people who are trained in means without regard to learning the ends. Trained people are great to have around. Many of us today here are maybe trained for a fair number of things. And we need trained people. But as a force for good, they're neutral, just as classically educated people are neutral. No magic bullets anywhere. All of us have the immense and immediate potential for both good and bad. And education alone will funnel us into neither category. But how do we foster people who are not only smart, but knowledgeable? And not only knowledgeable, but wise, in the sense that what they know, they carry well because they carry it accurately and modestly and prudently. Without, that is, with the hubris that's characterized Western man, at least since the 17th century. How do we, in short, pave the way for contemplatives? One answer is to ensure that what we learn at home and also in the schoolroom, the stuff we call knowledge, is never disconnected from the world of the spirit. Because indeed it isn't disconnected by its nature. But as always, the question is how. And here is where the classical model of intellectual formation once again has some clues to lend on strengthening the inner self, the soul, both in the Judeo-Christian and in the more purely Aristotelian sense of the soul. Let's remind ourselves how the Romans did it, not merely with any dry antiquarian interest, but to see what they and their methods might have to teach us about moving forward on a better foundation. They placed a decent faith in what we call education, though it remained a surprisingly modest one. The first thing the Romans did not do was try to be original. That's the modern world's besetting sin. They didn't have tenured academics upsetting one sensible practice after another, turning out counterintuitive study after another with extravagant grants in their back pockets, studies purporting to make radical discoveries on how we learn as well as what is worth learning. You know, Romans could be arrogant on a gargantuan scale with many things. But when it came to education and schooling, they seemed to know when to stand down, shut up, and listen to their betters, who were, of course, the Greeks. Parenthetically, here's one reason for the rot in our current systems of schooling. Most people making the decisions are enslaved to the modern view and think themselves too scientific to consult the past for anything but lessons in how not to live and think. Why look to the past when we have all these studies coming out? And surely the newer the observation, the more reliable it must be. Slavish thinking indeed. Here's the point. From the Greeks, the Romans took the idea that what gets learned in the classroom must surpass the practical. It must surpass the practical. Why? Because that's what a classroom is for. And that's where its activities lead, from the practical to, shall we say, the less than practical, to the theoretical. In that sense, schooling was about what many people now, and no doubt many people at the time, would have deemed the superfluous, the extras. By the way, this remains for me a real benchmark in evaluating working or potential curricula in schools. Whenever anybody asks my advice about what their schools should be doing, though I'm not the best person to ask, I ask another question in return. What are children or adolescents least likely to get outside of school with systematic regularity? What are they least likely to get outside? And the answer is almost always languages and math. Languages and math. Very well, make those two subjects the core of the curriculum and move out from there. Whatever else you can do, if you can do more things, marvelous. But you've got to do that. But whatever you do, don't compromise that core. And this is a real core and not all that common anymore. That was cheap, but But don't compromise it in the name of anything, no matter what the students say they like or what the parents say will help their children to like school better. I'm very glad my parents never cared about whether I liked school or not. I did eventually. But this is what I would like to put on sweatshirts, if I had the kind of mind that would put things on sweatshirts. We're there to give them what they need, not what they want. That's usually different. Aristotle understood that. What you need is usually not what you want. Just take food, for instance, and do I need to move out from there? What you need is often not what you want. Why is that? Why should that be any different in the intellectual life? Did the Romans' schools, as we may put it, serve their economy? Well, that's a big concern of ours today. Did the schools fit children for the world of getting and spending? Well, surely it had to have done so. Any merchant would have needed to be literate to some fair degree and would certainly have had to be numerate. Businessmen need to count things. And if that's all a child needed in life, he could and did learn those things either at home or as an apprentice, training with a man well-versed in all he would likely need to know to practice that trade, whatever trade it may be, successfully. This was what vocational training looked like to the Romans. Indeed, to most people throughout history, not vocational school or community college, but apprenticeship. Now, imagine how much treasure many good families would stop wasting today if we could go back to that model. We deserve harsh judgment, I think, for devaluing people who don't opt for the more standard college or university simply because their natures lead them to those more practical and often perfectly useful and noble pursuits that require little or no book learning. We're not as diverse as we pretend to be. So let's say that you, as a Roman, wish to live or wish your son or daughter to live a purely practical life, one directed to the exercise of certain skills and hence schooling for which would be limited only to the skills one must know in order to get on in the world. Well, very well, that's available to you. There are ways for you to become, were you not born into it already, a farmer or builder or sculptor or olive oil merchant or sandal maker or horse breaker or soldier or sailor or winemaker. I even think that even now, one non-degreed winemaker equals 20 people with degrees in silly majors that have the word studies dragging up the rear in their names. Don't laugh, this is a pragmatic calculation. Because who is best poised to bring more happiness into the world, the ideologically initiated or the maker of wine? Now that was an applause line. Nor should we assume that Roman children who went on to attend more school after, say, the age of 10, those, that is, who went on to study or prepare themselves to study the higher, more theoretical things, would always be heading into more lucrative lives. The factors of family, inheritance, and talent presented too many complications to determine that happy outcome with any real certainty. No doubt, the Roman Empire entertained many semi-literate millionaires, as we do, probably. And that doesn't seem to have been deemed a great injustice at the time. And it certainly didn't invalidate what the schools were trying to nurture, which was something different from getting on. As any Roman could have told you, fortune chooses to smile on different people differently. Life, then as now, was never about guarantees. But presumably those young people who were made to go on to higher study hailed from families suited with a modicum of substance, as teachers and tutors back then could be hugely expensive. If you were a mom doing homeschooling and you're especially good at it, you could really be farming out your talents. Some of the top teachers, in fact, could be something like celebrities, naming their prices and serving the highest bidders. And of course, the families they served weren't all altruistic and high-minded. They might very well have had nothing but baldly political ambitions for themselves and their children. They might have wanted their sons to become lawyers and statesmen and generals like Cicero and Caesar, not so that they might serve their country with fidelity and pietas, with a sense of duty and honor, but simply so that they could mount the power pyramid. And how did they achieve that? Well, briefly, how the Romans set up their schools tells us much about how even this very practical culture viewed what we would call higher education, not to be confused with college and university, but I mean that stage for them that would start around the age of 12 and go to 16 or 17. Education, in other words, embracing facts and ideas beyond the requisites of daily life. For the education they endorsed was, in effect, it does tell us much about what they deemed the higher pursuits and aspirations for a burgeoning and sophisticated culture. How much alike were they to us? Now, these families might have been shameless in their lust for success, as many of us are, but were their sons sent off to take courses with titles like, and I have had some fun with this, Statesmanship for the Ambitious, How to Get Richer Than Croesus, Arguing Before the Praetor, Making the Worse Cause the Better, How to Make the Senate Listen to You, How to Cheat an Egyptian, Assassinating Your Enemies, or How to Become Consul in 10 Easy Steps while deflecting the risks onto others, Building a Better Aqueduct. Now there's one. Let's see what they thought vital for, say, statesmen to know and how they should come to know it. In other words, what the better students ought to learn in school after they had gained the rudiments. One spectacular trait of Roman schools that strikes us when we look under the hood is, for being a practical people, how very literary they were when it came to training the young. Their methods relied heavily on drill and memorization, rote learning, or as a progressive educator, as distinguished from a teacher, might have it, on dead learning. A child, and again, not a student yet, mind you, but a pupil. I wish we would go back to that distinction between student and pupil. Began his, and to the credit of the Romans increasingly, her formal schooling with the ludus literarius, where immediate emphasis fell on words and all that they carry in their train. Syllables, word formation, vocabulary, memorizing texts to recite, much of this work being solitary, the teachers setting constant and demanding exercises in lieu of tests to evaluate how the pupil was getting along. And all this by the age of 9 or 10. Next, assuming moderate success after this first stage, the pupil went on to work with a grammaticus, an especially exacting class of teacher where the emphasis turned full scale to writing and speaking well. For then as now, the surest sign of the educated man or woman is to be found in the use of language. He who speaks precisely tends to think precisely, and he who thinks precisely has a better shot at living well. And not just materially well, but intellectually and even spiritually too. This isn't simply a life skill. For the Romans, thinking well and using words precisely and expressively made the barest prerequisite to citizenship. And in this, our own American founding fathers agreed. What kind of nation would we be now if those who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution wrote with more errant, scattershot passion than cool detachment and with a flair for the poetic turn of phrase? And so, a great premium was placed also on elocution, on delivery. Proper pronunciation was far from a sideline. It was essential as everything else. Hence, it's unlikely that many schooled Roman young people suffered the Latin equivalent of the diarrheal use of that dear little word like, and the unthinking overuse and misuse of perfectly good words like awesome. And why? Why wouldn't they have done that? Because they would have come to know instinctively as they grew up that they do not own the language they use. They were merely trustees passing it on to others with some simulacrum of health. I wish we could go back to that assumption too. The English language does not belong to me. I may be gone next year, I may be gone 20 years from now, but it goes on, and I hope at the end someone can put on my tombstone, he didn't hurt it much. Believe me, start thinking that way about the words you use, and you'll use them differently, and immediately. Here is where the pupil would also begin to learn Greek more formally, as the Roman world, of course, was bilingual. Though if he'd come from an especially rich household, he probably would have had Greek nannies speaking the language to him from the cradle, much as the well-heeled English families in the Victorian age used to hire French governesses, so that their children, too, would be bilingual by the time they entered school. The lead up to all this was to be serious literary reading, which would consist of poetry and history. Poetry, the pupil would have been memorizing from the beginning of his conscious life, probably, and Virgil really was a popular poet, not just a great one. But the study of history emerged after a while into the standard curriculum to become another ingredient in that run of things that educated men and women should know, not merely as another exercise in massive memorization, though it might have well been that too, but also as a lesson in morality, a ring on an old idea that history is philosophy teaching by example. This is when you learned your Livy, and you learned him very well, and so became able to understand yourself to be part of a greater whole, a citizen of a culture as well as a nation. And today, we still nod to a version of this practice, though history, or social studies, whatever they're calling it now, in modern schools is just as likely to be exclusively a catalog of sins, the purpose of which is to make people feel righteous and superior for being modern, instead of a study of the past as a humbling spur to knowledge and virtue and a proper sense of human perfectibility. Well, later on, the subject of rhetoric would embrace not only philosophy, but require a grasp of geography, music, geometry. You see where the trivium and the quadrivium in the medieval schools emerged from. It didn't come out of whole cloth. It came out of the ancient world. And by this time, the youth would be around 15 and well ready to leave school altogether and begin to work, either with his hands or with his head. And you can see how he's become enculturated and something like educated. Some might say propagandized, though a person schooled in this way would probably have developed enough of what we call critical skills not to accept just anything he was told. He knew too much real history to be so gullible. He had learned not only to judge other peoples, but most of all, how to judge Romans. And the Romans, like the Greeks, knew how to be their own harshest critics. This distinction in practice points up the difference between the educated and the propagandized mind, I think. The one is prompted to think, and the other is anesthetized to thought. The one is given the greatest questions, the other is supplied with canned answers. The one seeks a measured and rational view of oneself and others, the other can be lulled into satisfaction with caricatures. Where did the pupil go from here? Again, he went either to work into the legions, or after his stint in the army had been served, he went on for further study. But studying what? The only thing that meant higher education in the classical world, philosophy. That's what it meant. Did you wish to be a lawyer? You'll study philosophy. Do you wish to be a teacher worthy of the charge of forming young minds? You'll study philosophy. Do you wish to be a statesman of the kind to be remembered with everlasting affection by your fellow countrymen, one whose fame would outlive you and inspire generations yet unborn? You would study philosophy for sure. Philosophy was the grand terminus. So here, in briefest outline, is how the Romans looked at education. It started with the practical basics, yes, but the further the pupil advanced, and in so doing ideally converting himself from a pupil into a student is someone who burns to know. That doesn't describe a lot of people in schools. The farther he went, the less practical and the more theoretical the life of his intellect became. One didn't learn about nature merely to manipulate it, but to gain knowledge of it, simply because it was worth knowing and taking pains about. One didn't learn about man, broadly speaking, what we would call the humanities now, in order to change his own nature either, but to gain another kind of knowledge and understanding. One hoped, in a word, to become wise. For the world did not improve by knowledge alone. Wisdom has to pick up the torch where knowledge leaves off. Perhaps the world could not be improved, but man could be made more perfect so long as he didn't make himself his own God. Now, how distant this old vision stands next to the modern one, which is geared not for the acquisition of wisdom, but for the mechanical task of fitting wedges into slots. The point here is not that practicality was not prized. The Romans were an immensely practical people, much more so than the Greeks. And for this reason, the Romans had mastered enough of the arts of governing so as to build an empire the Greeks could have scarcely imagined. Nor are there material accomplishments to be sneezed at. So much of what they built that was allowed to remain was not only functional, a value we approve, but beautiful, a value we've lost even the capacity intelligently to comprehend. So exalted is the very idea of the beautiful. Think about it. How many of the buildings and monuments we erect these days are likely to be standing 2,000 years from now? 2,000 years from now. Some of them may not be there 100 years from now. We think of ourselves as a superior people, certainly superior enough to criticize and look down our noses at anybody who didn't have the splendid good taste and fortune to have been born in the time we were. And yet, not even our buildings are made to last. It gives us pause to imagine how much less enduring, how thin might our reigning ideas and assumptions prove to be. Well, as interesting, I think, and as consequential as all this is, what does it have to do with contemplation, harmonious or otherwise? Simply this, that the goal of the intellectual life, which is knowledge and wisdom, provides us with the starting point for the spiritual life, which is enriched and some might say animated by the quest for the contemplative life. I imagine everyone in here uses a GPS. I used one for the first time 2 days ago. Not my own, I borrowed someone's to see what they're like. What a way to travel. Led by the nose. I enjoyed it, and I love that female voice. We men are told that we don't like taking directions from women, but I prefer her to any other voice, but she does get angry at me, and that because I like to go off the track and do other things. And you notice, even when you get off the road to get gas, she gets a little angry. You hear it in her voice. It's that, turn around, and get back on the motorway. I suppose someone has already programmed in some insults. And I wish she would just insult me, because I know she's thinking it anyway, so she might as well say it. But the thing about GPS, a piece of technology which I really admire, but I really don't want to own it, I've decided, because I don't always want to know where I'm going, exactly, unless I'm really in a hurry. And it occurred to me that this is pretty much the world that the public schools want us to live in. The government's going to give us the coordinates and the directions, and all we need to do is turn left at the second light. That's the way we're going to live our lives. So this is not really a slam at GPS, but the goal of education is to learn to drive on your own, and to learn to get lost sometimes, and then you learn lessons from getting lost. Maybe I'm saying that pridefully because I've been lost enough times, and I'm justifying that, making a virtue of it. Well, let me illustrate from a recent experience, not because the illustration is particularly revealing one, but because it's mine, of what I'm trying to embody here. Among my other college teaching duties right now, I lead a freshman honors seminar every fall in the humanities. This is up in Virginia, which is, as it ought to be, a catch-all word, humanities, signifying history, literature, philosophy, art, and even music. Now, students admitted to the honors program may or may not be the most intelligent students in the college, though I tend to think most of them are. But they're certainly among the hardest working. With few exceptions, they do the work asked of them, which is one reason why they did so well in high school. And as they enter the college as honors students, we wish to give them something distinctive immediately upon the launch of their college years, a somewhat, if not astronomically, greater challenge than they would get otherwise. Well, during my first year teaching in the program a few years ago, I gave those students a mostly standard order freshman survey history course, covering the millennia from prehistory to the earliest murmurings of man in Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Chinese and the Hebrews, to the momentous contributions of the Greeks and Romans to the Middle Ages in the West. And that's a lot to do. And I hope I don't flatter myself in saying that the course went fairly well. But this was AP stuff, I thought. What more could I give them alongside this essential material? The answer, red meat. Though I hoped they would be, intellectually speaking, there would be no militant herbivores in the ranks. I would have them, these were college freshmen living in a distracted age, I would have them read the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, the whole thing, all 10 books, along with everything else we were doing. Now, not surprisingly, I had some experienced and able colleagues warding me off the idea. The book would be too hard for them, they reasonably feared. I acknowledged the logic, knowing that it's now possible, even from some of the better high schools, to graduate without having read one major classic work. I exclude contemporary authors here because we can't always know what will be a classic in 100 years or so. And now, of course, they would be asked to read in its entirety one of the greatest works of all time. I would be asking no small thing, but the notion that this book would bear fruit for them, I simply couldn't shake. So I resolved to try it while heeding my colleagues' warnings by installing an escape valve in the syllabus. Should the close reading and thinking that the book demands become on the ground needlessly burdensome. The mission is to teach, after all, not to torture them. But as I realized that, depending on their major, I may be the very last instructor in all their lives to ask them to read a single work from the noble tradition of the classical world. I raised the sails, got a flutter of the wind, and set out. They could, if only for a while, swim in the bracing waters of the intellect, with which college ought to have something to do, after all. They deserved this shot at something great. Most of them had not been homeschooled, they had not gone to classical Christian schools, they'd gone to public schools, and they were used to getting by fairly easily. Of course, they were daunted, and I used this little ploy the very first year I did it. I brought in my copy, my Greek copy of Aristotle's Ethics that I used, and said, "This is what we're going to read." And I would open it up to them, and I'd walk around the room, and they would look at the Greek text. And but then I would pull out this translation, and say, "But you'll read this." It worked. Oh, I guess we can do that. Well, we did read the work completely, though not all at once. Aware that their spans of attention would likely get strained, I spread the reading out over the entire term, plowing into Book 1 in mid-September and wrapping up Book 10 by the last week of the term in December, touching down on one book or chapter every 10 days or so amid all our other reading and discussion of history and literature. What were the results? Far more heartening than I had any right to expect. It wouldn't be honest to say that all students enjoyed the reading, nor would it be honest to say that all benefited hugely. I've no doubt that some of these people could never rouse themselves to sup at Aristotle's table. To some, he was just another onerous assignment. But others blossomed. For the first time, they were seeing what it's like to do philosophy in a formal way. Though I always reminded them that they've been philosophers since they were toddlers. Aristotle was only doing it the way the big kids do it. The only difference is that he is sitting with grown-ups and we're still sitting at the kids' table. So many of those silly questions that they asked when they were young. Why can't the dog talk? Why does it rain? What makes blue blue and why isn't it yellow? These were some of my niece's questions. I wrote them down. Why do I have to pick up my toys and clean my room when Mom does it so much better? That's a very good question. Why is it not okay that I just take the skates out of the store without paying for them? Why am I sad? Why did Grandma die? Now, those questions were really philosophical ones, I said. Yes, they've been philosophers. In fact, they've been contemplatives, I assured them, for roughly 16 years, which is already a lengthy career if you think about it. The only reason they don't know this about themselves is not that they finally got the answers to those questions, but as with most of us, the questions got sophisticated out of them, squeezed out by trivial distraction or later by the unearned cynicism of the cool guy or gal that doesn't care about all that. Or simply because the questions got too big for them, the possible answers too unsettling. And in some ways, it's easier to live by ignoring them. We all adjust, don't we? Well, the topics Aristotle grappled with in that work set the agenda for some of the best discussions of the term. First, he asks, what is the object of life? Why are we here? Is it for pleasure? Or is there something higher that we can live for? Honor, perhaps? Simple questions, I asked. Then let's see how simple and how clear your answers are. For these are not only philosophical questions, but spiritual and religious ones as well, aren't they? However we respond to that query, we're in the weeds from the beginning. And there's a real joy to be had in chopping our way out of them. And so it goes on for weeks. What is moral goodness? Must we be born with it, or can we develop it? Can we, in fact, become better human beings tomorrow than we are today? Is a life bolstered by self-control a richer or a more impoverished one? That gave us a very good discussion. What is virtue? What is justice? Can you have a good country without citizens who are also good? Is a life directed toward taking on as much pleasure and acquiring as much stuff as possible enough? What is true friendship? And have you ever really known it? What is happiness? Now, I invite you to step back and ruminate on these questions and explain how anyone with a trace of human intelligence can, by the longest stretch of the imagination, hold that this book is somehow irrelevant for today's students. It's about as relevant to the life we lead every day in 2015 as relevance gets. And I, for one, believe the answers that each one of us individually would give to those questions would be eminently useful to us. What amazes me is that we made it through this entire semester and tackled these questions under Aristotle's guidance while reading along the timeline of history and wrestling with a few fine pieces of literature at the same time. It was a pretty full menu. But what was achieved? Well, this I cannot know. For the most part, these good students passed the quizzes and performed well on the exams and produced some fairly proficient writing. And it was with more than a little satisfaction that when I looked over the course evaluations, over half of the class that first year claimed the Aristotle portion of the course to be their favorite. Former public school students. So by all external measures, which are not unimportant, they performed admirably. Yet, we all know, or ought to know, that the prime reason that we are set to reading great works in the first place is that doing so will leaven our very selves, will leave us different, better human beings, because more well-informed and enlightened, and better poised to be startled by the essence of human existence. The benefits, in short, transcend the realm of the intellect. That's the point. We become not so much locked within the prison of self. In a word, and with a prayer, we become wiser. But then wisdom poses an internal measure that is not for us as teachers to gauge. That's their business, because it's their soul. There are at least two small lessons I take from this experience. First, as with the Romans, school is not primarily for navel-gazing or gaining skill sets, or fun, or feeling better about ourselves. It's for the systematic search for truth, the quest to discover those things worth living for, and somehow finding the strength to live for them. Yes, all this can begin as a series of dry exercises, but ideally, the quest doesn't remain dry, not even when ultimate values are approached and discovered and embraced. Which brings us to the second lesson. We might say that we learn so that we can graduate to contemplation, so that we may harmonize ourselves with existence, to see the world, as Proust might have said, with new eyes. No less august a figure than Aristotle himself assured us of this in the Ethics. The highest purpose of life is to be found not in the busy active life, however vital that action may be to the life well lived. In the earthly sense, it's to be found in theoria, in the contemplative order of mind and spirit. Here is where all the reading, all the studying, ideally is to lead, to the edge of contemplation, to seeing creation over and again as if for the first time. That's as a pagan would have it. Now, but then from the Christian perspective, the rewards are far richer. Because it was Thomas Merton who once reminded us that in the garden before the fall, in paradise, human beings were meant to be, and this is the word he used, contemplatives. That was the plan. We were made, in other words, we were created not to spend our essence on acting and getting, but on beholding. And so contemplatives, beholders, we are to become again, if that is, we're to enjoy the beatific vision in the world to come. Every time we think a polished thought, or ask a probing question, or read a book above our punching weight, and become more adept at reflecting on the higher, more permanent things, the things worth living for, both in and out of this world, we raise ourselves above the earthbound and breathe freer air. We might, on a good day, even find a grain of wisdom. But can we keep it? None of this alone may be sufficient to save a soul, but no book alone, nor can any scheme of education do that anyway. And the rest, of course, must be left to the love that moves the sun and the other stars. Nice Dantean note to end on. Thank you. Thank you. Am I allowed to dismiss the class? I'm happy to take any if you have them. If I were you, I'd want to get up. Yes, ma'am. Reading. Well, your children, probably 12. For the rest of the world, 18. No, look, it's good to have some life and some disappointment behind you when you read it. You remember Marva Collins in Chicago, who had children reading Dante, and she was very proud of this. And they put these children on 60 Minutes. It was a marvelous little story in one way, because you had 11, 12-year-olds talking about how they read Dante. But really, what are 11 and 12-year-olds getting out of it? They're getting out more than we may understand. They're probably getting out a good narrative element, so that's worth it. But are they getting the spiritual value out of it? It may be, unless they've come from very unfortunate places in their lives. They may not have the maturity yet. So I think 17, 18 is a marvelous place to read Aristotle's Ethics. Or 80. And of course, I go back and read the Greek every summer as I prepare to read the translation with them in the fall. I've got to do something in those monasteries, right? So I sit there and read Greek all day. It's a marvelous exercise. So if you've not read it, do. Another thing I bring into the students when Aristotle's Ethics in most translations is about that thick. It's not a big book, but sometimes I'll bring in Thomas Aquinas' commentary on the Ethics, and it's about that thick. It looks like a phone book. So, yes. I go all over with it. I use the Ross, which is the Oxford University Press, but I also use the Thompson and the Tridenic, which is the Penguin edition. I think they're both good. I've not seen a bad translation. There's one by Sachs, who teaches or taught at St. John's Annapolis. That's a good one, and it has a useful set of notes, but he translates things in a funny way that has most people hugely disliking the translation. So I don't use it for that reason. I find it personally useful, but I wouldn't want to give that to students. I can't remember. Latin started around 9, and Greek 12 or 13. Yeah. But others were doing it around me, so there was nothing remotely heroic about it. And I wasn't the best student in the class for the first couple of years either. Did fine, but it took me a couple of years, 3 years, really to enjoy it. Thank you very much. You're a great crowd.